Okay, today we're going to do two or three things. Three things. We're going to provide information about IEP compliance in general as it relates to transition, and then address specifically the areas of the IEP that are going to be affected by the high school credential information, and then provide you some resource links at the end to help you answer any other questions you might have. Post-secondary transition, as you know, is broad. It has gotten more complicated in recent years as things have gotten many more options than just go to college, go to work, or go to the military. Today, there are many more things you can do in the post-secondary world, but our goal as educators is to make sure that we're planning for it, that it is a process, that ultimately our students are going to leave us, they're going to go to the community, and we need to help them make decisions along the way so that the choices they make produce the outcomes that they want and that they expect. Transition IEPs are very much like every IEP. Start with assessments and then move from the results of those assessments to targeted statements in the present levels of academic and functional performance and in the findings to develop appropriate post-secondary goals for the student, and then identify the transition services to be provided during that year of the IEP, the life of the IEP, and the appropriate course of study and annual goals to help the student meet whatever their post-secondary goals are. This should sound very much like every IEP. And this is just the slide that we always use because we want to re-emphasize every single time that planning is how we bring the future into the present so that we can do something about it now. As we've all heard for years and years, transition happens. Regardless, we'd rather it be by design than by default.
About transition IEP, we do want to focus on post-secondary goals. Now, in terms of the credential, this piece is going to remain the same. Every student in South Carolina from ages 13 and above have to have transition addressed in their IEP. You know that the two post-secondary goals that are required for all students are those that training and the career employment goals. So as you're working with your credentialed students, you're still going to be looking at what are they going to be doing down the line after they exit, even though you're doing things a little differently to prepare them for these pieces while they're in school. This one on independent living skills is the one that is for those students who have another need in addition to the two that we just talked about. Remember, the first two, of course, are required for all. Independent living skills is sometimes one that gets overlooked. It's not just for those students who have health care or have daily living kinds of skills that they might need. It's for any student who will have a need that they might have to have extra help with along the way in order to access that adult world. If you look at some of the things on here, renting an apartment, accessing transportation, replacing legal documents, all of those things are things that your students as credentialed students are going to need. Are they prepared now, or do you see them needing support once they exit to continue to be able to access these particular elements related to the adult living world? And of course, your first step is assessments. This piece you're going to see some additions to, because in the credential piece, there are going to be some other types of assessments you're going to have to consider. But you have to make sure that it's appropriate for each individual student. Remember, assessments are required. It's an integral part of the transition process. It can happen anywhere, anytime. Traditionally, we always think about the academic needs of the student. Those are transition needs. There are functional needs that we have to address. But some considerations for assessments in this particular case with the credentials program is probably going to be a little different. You're going to be looking at some specific work site skills this student's going to need on the job that they may be going to while they're within that program and doing the work hours, but also those skills that will translate into that real world situation. These are assessments that you're going to have to adjust. You're going to have to maybe even use some work site assessments that maybe people are using on site and that employers are using. So think about the types of skills that student is going to need, and keep in mind, you know, there'll be several students possibly going to a similar work site or the same work site. That doesn't mean that the same assessment and the same list of skills will be appropriate for each of those students. This is one of the cautions we have to give. We saw it when students were entering Project Search, where they were in a hospital setting. And what we saw was that districts were trying to make the IEP conform so that everybody's IEP looked the same, rather than address the skills, because students go into these settings at different levels of ability. So we've got to focus on what each student needs in terms of those worksite skills.
So to reiterate what Marietta just said, we have always seen lots of interest inventories and lots of student preferences, more than aptitude, in our transition assessments, which has made it very difficult in some cases to determine transition findings. We've had interest and preferences, but not true skills-related findings. So this type of assessment will require some of you to use some different assessments, additional assessments, in addition to the interest and preferences you've been diagnosing all along, because interest and preferences do have to be considered. Interest inventories are fine. The example we have here, that David's interested in becoming a welder, that is good information. We need to know that in order to help him make his post-secondary goals appropriate for what his interests are. But interest inventories do not equal findings. Interest and preferences are not the same things. Findings are skills related, and they are assessments of whether or not the student already has mastered the skill. Because what the emphasis is to, of course, as with the rest of the IEP, teach students the skills they don't know to capitalize on the skills they already have.
Another part, and we started, needs are also related to transition. A lot of people simply defaulted to those as the findings. Well, those make up part of the findings, but that doesn't mean that's everything related to what that student needs. So we've got to look beyond just the academics, and again, especially in this credentials area, because of the work site situations you're going to be sending those students into. They're going to be skills they need that are academic, but they're also going to be specific functional skills and work-related skills. So please don't just limit yourself or limit the student to one particular area when you're looking at the actual needs of the student.
So while we would expect to continue to see academic skills as transition needs, for students who are pursuing the South Carolina high school credential, we would expect to see additional assessments focusing more on work-based skills, particularly as the student gets older. We recognize that when the child first enters the credential program, if you will, when they're entering 9th grade, their major needs may still be academic, and that is fine. Those may be transition needs, but as the student gets into more and more community-based kinds of trainings, then those needs will become that much greater, and we should then see findings based on the needs the child is demonstrating in that setting. But assessments have to be individualized, just like the rest of the IEP. One size assessment does not fit all. The same assessment will not be appropriate for your 8th graders entering 9th grade as they will for your juniors becoming seniors ready to leave. And the same assessment would not be appropriate for all of those rising 9th graders. Assessments should match the student's interests and preferences and academic levels, just like the rest of the IEP is going to match. And this is where you'll document it. There are a lot of places you can get assessment information. This is just one. You don't have to use this. You certainly may use this. We got this from a school district in the state when we were in that district monitoring, and we thought it was pretty good, so we thought we'd share it with you. The best thing about this form is the second line where it says completed by, and you have all those various options there. we like that so much because transition is all about the student's entire life, what they're doing not only at school, but outside of school, at home, at leisure, at work. And this allows you to clearly show information gathered from all of those sources, people who know that student in all those settings, the special ed teacher, of course, the student, who all too often is left out of the whole process, the rest of the family, the general ed teachers, administrators, counselors. We would expect then the others to be employers or whoever might know that student. We do want to make sure we say that not every one person is going to fill out this entire form. Different people will know different pieces of information for this form. The work experience will be largely from employers or your job coaches or whoever has worked with the student in that setting. The student's general ed teachers would not necessarily know much about that, so they just wouldn't put anything in that box. But they should know about academic strengths and needs. So we want to emphasize that this is to get a lot of information about the student from a variety of sources so that you do have a good picture of the student before you start trying to help the student plan. This is also eye-opening to students sometimes because they don't see themselves the same way that all of these other folks see them. And a lot of times there will be strengths there that they don't realize they have because it's just them. It's just the way they've always been. They see that as that's just the way I am, and don't realize that often that is a strength. At least it's a strength in certain settings. In talking about transition services, we need to remember, first of all, what they are. Transition services are designed to be a results-oriented process. What is it that you expect to see? What is it that should happen at the end of the process? It should focus on results, but it should also focus on academic and functional achievement to help the student move from school to post-school life, whatever that post-school life is going to look like for that student. And the danger here is that we tend to shuffle students. We tend to pigeonhole them a little bit when they say, I want to be whatever they tell you they want to be. But we've got to keep that open. We've got to keep looking at all the areas. And the way to do that is to address all of these various areas of transition services. These should look familiar because they're the ones that are on the IEP.
Some of these become more important with this credentials program as you look at the vocational education, the integrated employment, the adult services. Some of these, especially the two employment ones, the vocational education and the employment, you're going to probably see some services that are tied into the student's program with the credential. So in the past, most people have just talked about instruction, which is the education piece. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that as well and incorporating as many of those. You'll see them listed on this slide here in terms of instruction. Everything you do is instruction. We know that. But what you're going to see now is that through some of this employment pieces and the work site, this is going to be going out into the community. It's going to be working in developing that employment, those objectives. Some of it could be directly tied to daily living skills for those students. So this is going to become vital, more so, and not just be an automatic checkbox on instruction. What else is going to be involved with your credential students that are directly related to that program while they're with you throughout their high school career?
One thing we don't see very often is the functional vocational evaluation. And we would expect, again, as we go forward, to begin to see more of those, understanding that it is an evaluation like any other evaluation. So it would need to be planned and parent consent would need to be obtained before you conduct that vocational evaluation. There have always been a lot of questions that we've encouraged people to ask when they were talking with their students about their post-secondary plans. These are going to become even more important than they used to. What experiences must the student participate in this academic year in order to achieve their post-secondary goals? Because transition services in the transition post-secondary considerations section of the IEP are those services that the student will participate in this academic year. There's always been some confusion about that. We've always seen things like post-secondary agencies and things like that, which is appropriate if the student is going to work with them during the current academic year of that IEP. So it's forcing you a little bit to think about it year by year, while at the same time you keep the overarching post-secondary goals in mind. What services and instruction are essential this year? And that's where we do see that the academic needs of the student are still appropriate. They're still important. And for some students, they are the most important. For other students, they're not the most important. But certainly you have to consider that kind of instruction. What do we have to do this year to keep moving towards the post-secondary goal? And then the last one on this page is really, do we know enough? Do we know enough about this student's interests, preferences, skills, needs to identify appropriate post-secondary goals? And if we don't, we need to immediately understand we have to go back to more assessments. The do we know enough question should always be a question that the team asks itself when they're talking about students and talking with students about post-secondary needs. In terms of the credential, if the high school, and this year, for the next year or two, there are still a few district credentials out there, but if the state high school credential or the district credential is selected on the IEP, we must continue to ensure that parents and students understand it is not a South Carolina State High School diploma. Parents now are hearing South Carolina credential, and they are jumping to the conclusion that that is the same as it's another kind of high school diploma. So we do need to, for now, keep emphasizing that it is not a state high school diploma. You do need to remember, too, that the anticipated date of graduation can be updated as you go. While it doesn't remove the student from the original cohort that they are in, it is okay as a student moves through the credential or the diploma to change the anticipated graduation as we go. A lot of times we say our students can't earn the high school diploma in 4 years, so they need to work towards a credential. The high school diploma may or may not be a 4-year program, even though it's a 4-year plan. For some of our students, it may be a 5-year plan or a 6-year plan, and that is okay. By changing the date of graduation anticipated as you go through the student's academic career in the high school grades, that makes it clear to the parent and the student that while they may not graduate with either the credential or the diploma in the end of 4 years, they are still moving towards that. And it is a good idea for those students for whom you expect it to take longer than 4 years to be upfront and say that at the very beginning of the discussions.
As we're talking about the considerations and how it aligns, some of the pieces of the IEP are going to continue to be addressed in the same way you always have. Assessments and findings that identify skills with data as to where that student is now in terms of each of those skills, the interest and preferences, the post-secondary goals, career cluster, graduation date, exit date that Ann just talked about, their transition services, age of majority. All of these you're going to continue to address exactly the same way as you always have, whether the student is a credentialed student or not.
For these areas, for the most part, we're doing pretty well with this area. We've just finished some Indicator 13 reviews, as you all know. Assessments and findings would be the area of this that gives us the most problem right now, because we do tend to still be relying on interest and preferences rather than actual skills-based findings. But whether the student is pursuing the South Carolina State High School Diploma or the South Carolina High School Credential, you would look individually at these areas in the post-secondary consideration section of the IEP the same way you always have. But for a few sections, it's going to look a little bit different. When we're aligning the South Carolina High School Credential with the Enrich IEP, there are a few areas that we're going to have to just look at differently. The course of study is going to be, if this is not already in Enrich, look for it, it'll be coming out soon. The standard course of study towards a state high school credential. You all have seen the one towards a state high school diploma. This one will be added. In the high school projected outcome There's always been that one that you weren't quite sure what to put for those middle school students. You will either put the state high school credential, non-diploma for your high school students, or you will put not yet determined, because we know that we have to make this consideration, this decision, sometimes earlier than the end of 8th grade, because our students may be a little older, and because in South Carolina we dip that back so much younger to consider it. So if you are making this decision prior to the end of 8th grade, just in general post-secondary services, you would put not yet determined for the high school outcome. We get this question a lot for our students who have been not included in the general ed curriculum for much of their school academic career, are not fully included for much of their academic career, or who are pursuing working towards alternative standards, modified curriculum, that sort of thing, to put the projected outcome as the high school diploma, which is what you usually had to do, didn't seem quite realistic for them, and we agree with that. So we have put this not yet determined option. Now this would be not only for high school credential students, but for any middle schoolers who may be age 13 and you're having to address the option in South Carolina, but you're not comfortable saying either credential or diploma. You can say not yet determined if that student has not yet reached the end of 8th grade. The modifications section of the IEP, where we list, is right under the accommodations section. If the student isn't pursuing a modified curriculum, that must be stated and they must be explained. In many cases, we see accommodations put in the modifications box. We see modifications put in the accommodations box, and we don't see any of it explained in the text box. This is where we would encourage you, especially with the credential students moving forward, be very clear with what modifications are being made to the courses, to the general ed curriculum that they are taking. And then specifically in the text box, how is it different? What is it about what this student is doing, this student is achieving in the general ed curriculum that is different from what everyone else is? Now remember, if you're changing things like response options and things like that, that may well just be an accommodation. But if you are changing something that actually changes the standards that the student must meet, the academic standards, it is a modification, and that must be listed and that must be explained. Then in the services section of the IEP, this is the regular services section, not the post-secondary consideration section. That is going to have to look a good bit different depending on the community-based services that are being provided. In the past, you could have rolled transition into your academic areas if it was being conducted mainly through academic services. It could have been a separate area that just said transition. Now it may have to be several areas that say transition, if some of them are school-based and some of them are community-based, because the location of those services that you have to define in the services section of the IEP will be different. It also may be different in terms of who is providing the services. If it's in the workplace, it may be the employer under the with some supervision by a job coach. But it may not be a special ed teacher. It may not be a general ed teacher. So the services section is going to take some careful consideration for each and every student individually to ensure that that IEP services section truly reflects what that student's day looks like.
And keep in mind that if a student is with non-disabled peers for the time that they're in those work settings, there might not be any special ed related services or special education services, so you wouldn't have to necessarily put anything in terms of minutes. But if it's during the school day, you want to account for it, so just put the explanation in the text box, and
Right.
that way you can cover all of the bases for that student.
Right. In general, as students enter the South Carolina high school credential, we do need to use the text boxes in the IEP to put in better explanations as to what is different for this student because they are a South Carolina high school credential student. The text boxes will become much more important than they have been in the past. The LRE setting is going to look a little bit different too because of students being in the community more. And is the community setting a special ed setting? Is it a general ed setting? Are they with disabled peers or non-disabled peers? That kind of depends on where they're going to be. So there's not one answer we can give you for that. It is going to depend. If these students are going to, for example, a voc rehab workshop, those will be disabled peers they will be working with. If they are going down to a local hardware store, those will be non-disabled peers they will be working with. So it will depend. And if the student changes work sites during the course of the year, the IEP may have to be amended to reflect those changes through the amendment process. Not an entire new IEP, but certainly an amendment. And why you're doing that would be explained, of course, in the PWN, but also in the text boxes. What is happening with the student? Okay, Mike, if you have questions, break in.
Yeah, we have a few questions that are piling up here. We have 4.
Okay.
Okay, first one. Would a worksite assessment aligned to the PSG be considered a formal assessment?
Question is, if I understood you, Mike, would a work-based assessment that is aligned to the post-secondary goal be considered a formal assessment? Now, it could still be an informal assessment, and that doesn't really matter in terms of compliance, whether it's formal or informal. What's most important is what is the information telling you. So if you are observing, for example, and I think this is what you're talking about, observing a child in a work-based setting and you're gathering specific skills level data based on that, can you use that as your transition assessment? And the answer, of course, is yes, you certainly may. I would still say that that is an informal assessment, not a formal assessment. But it can certainly be used to establish transition needs and baselines from which to develop measurable annual goals related to pursuing that post-secondary outcome goal.
Alrighty. Sticking with assessments, is the schema an appropriate transition assessment to use for all students? We gather a baseline for students entering 9th grade, pull individual areas of need to address with each student, then monitor with teacher-made rubrics based on schema skill areas. We do the schema annually and continue to report on those results in, I forgot what this acronym means, but the PLAFP. We use teacher-made rubrics developed from schema as transition assessment each year after. Is this acceptable?
Yes.
Present levels.
You are using schema as a baseline in general when students enter 9th grade, and then you are continuing to administer it every year just to show growth over time. That is fine. That may or may not be enough information, specific enough information to establish specific skill related needs. But if you are supplementing that with teacher rubrics every year, those rubrics will actually become the informal assessment being used to establish specific skills level needs for that student, and that is perfectly acceptable, yes.
Okay, with the high school credential, our entire coursework is modified and tied to the standards, which are modified standards. Do you have some exemplars as to what that might say in the textbook to describe this, text box to describe this?
We do not at this point have those. We will hope to provide those as we move forward, but we do not at this point have specific examples of how that coursework will be modified. But you are absolutely correct. It will be modified based on some modifications to the standards that have already been identified, and they will need to be explained in the modifications box specific to that student. But we don't have specific examples to share at this time. We hope we'll have some by this summer or moving forward, but right now we don't.
Excellent. Okay, next one. If the student is working during the school day off campus with an employer, then the provider would still be the SE teacher?
Is the special education teacher providing the instructional services, if they are instructional services? It's going to come down to who's doing what and who's supervising what. That's why we say it depends a lot on how things are structured. If it is during the school day, it is certainly part of the student's school provided services. But then the district would need to be very clear in who is supervising that student's placement in that job site.
That's what I was talking about earlier. If the special ed teacher is providing, or somebody in related to special ed is providing some type of specialized instruction on that job site, then it would be included in the services section. But if that student is receiving all of the training just like anybody else, a non-IEP student, then,
Or a non-student,
or
for that
just
matter.
a non-student for that matter, if they're receiving what other people would receive, then it's with the general population of peers, and there wouldn't be necessarily time. It would be considered almost like general education time as opposed to special education time.
But it could also be considered as an indirect service provided by the special ed teacher, depending on how much guidance the special ed teacher is giving the employer about necessary accommodations or instructional delivery, or how many steps of directions the student can handle at one time. All of those things may be some indirect services through consultation and collaboration with the employer that the special ed teacher is providing. It will depend entirely on the specifics for that student. There's not going to be if you're a high school credential working in the workplace, this is what you put. These answers are not going to work that way. It is going to have to be truly an individual, student by student, job placement by job placement decision, which is when I said as things change during the year relative to those students, it may require an amendment. That may happen more with South Carolina high school credential students as things change, especially if students are rotating through different placements. And sometimes that happens just until you find one that works. And that's okay. It should happen. If something's not working, you stop it, you do something else. But then the IEP is going to have to change to reflect those changes. So there's not necessarily going to be one answer to the question that is going to be the same answer all year long. It may have to change throughout the year as what the student is doing and where they're doing it is changing throughout the year.
Wonderful. Okay, we have two more, if that's okay.
Sure.
With the credential, students take social studies and science, but we don't write goals for those areas. Where and how do we link these in the IEP and include the minutes?
When you're looking at science and social studies, what you have to look at are what are the skills the student needs to access that curriculum. It's usually reading, writing, and math. So as you're addressing the academic areas of reading, writing, and math, you're providing the specialized instruction needed, and you can do that through any medium that you choose. And it could be through the science curriculum, it could be through the math, and so forth. So it's not going to change that part of the services. It will just be you're identifying the fact that these are the types of materials that you're going to be using to address those skills in the areas where the student has displayed a need.
And you would put that in the services section text box.
All right. Will an employer need to attend the IEP meeting to cover their assessment after internship is completed, or can the South Carolina credential forms be sufficient?
Either way, it will depend on the student. If the employer has specific information that needs to be shared from the employer's perspective, you may want to invite the employer to the meeting. If the information can be presented as a summary by special education staff or special education support staff who may have been supervising the student on the job site, then that is okay. That will depend on the student, but either will work.
But keep in mind, if you are going to bring in the employer, that you have to have that signed consent prior to sending out the meeting notice, because that would be the same as an outside agency So you would get consent from the parent or maybe the adult student by the time the student is in the later years, prior to sending out that meeting notice, and then make sure that person or that entity is listed on the meeting notice and that it's sent out to them. So just keep those particular steps in mind too.
And that is as it is now, and as it certainly always is, but it may become more frequent that you would involve an outside agency in terms of an employer. But in many cases, if everything is going just great and you've got the data to show that everything is going just fine, then there's not necessarily a reason to bring the employer in to say everything's going just fine. But if a particular problem has arisen or something that was unexpected that no one saw coming, then you may want to include that employer in the meeting so that they can explain things to the student, to the parent, that are workplace-based issues that no one in the educational setting had a reason to anticipate. So it just depends on what needs to be shared. And if it needs to come from the employer, or it would be better heard if it came from the employer, then invite the employer. But if there's not a reason, then you certainly don't have to.
Okay, you might have covered this already, but will Enrich include a form for district attendance certificates similar to the South Carolina credential form?
Maybe. We're working with the Enrich folks now to see what we can get out in this next rollout and what we can't. If we can get one, we will, and if we can't, we'll keep working for it for next update next summer. But yes, we expect there will be one, but there is not, to my knowledge, at this point. But then nobody's going to quite have it, the credential yet, so we don't need it yet.
Okay, well that's all the questions that
Okay.
have been
All right.
submitted so far.
Okay, we're going to move next to annual goals. Annual goals will address skills deficits related to the South Carolina State credential, just like it does for everything else now. Any needs that have been established, skills-based needs, will be addressed through annual goals. What Marietta was just saying about the reading, math, and science, reading, math, and written language skills needs being addressed through annual goals for those students who are doing coursework in modified coursework in general ed for the credential in science and social studies will be covered in measurable annual goals. But it won't address a science goal, a social studies goal. It will address a reading goal, a math goal, or a written language goal as it relates to the science and social studies content areas. You can, if you want to be, if you feel like it's important to be specific that this is going to be done in the social studies curriculum or in the science curriculum, you can certainly make that part of the condition of the annual goal. You can certainly say using the modified science curriculum, the student will whatever, or when participating in the modified social studies curriculum, the student will whatever they're going to do. You can put that into the annual goals one by one. If you put that, though, everything you do related to reading or that goal's got to be done with that curriculum. So you can choose to put it there in the goal, or you can choose to put it in the text box explanation in the services section, or both. If you feel like you want it to be very clear to the parent that that's where this is happening. So that is up to you, but it can be addressed through the annual goals as well.
If you want to just stick with the way you've been writing goals and put it in the text box, be sure to also put it in the PWN under other relevant factors that the student's academic needs in the science curriculum and social studies curriculum or so forth. That would be a great place to also put that in there if you didn't want to put it in the actual goal, because we know the goals do need to be the sort of skills oriented. So you've got a couple of other options instead of just making it part of the goal. So, but like Ann said, it's totally up to what you decide and what's appropriate for that particular student that you're working with.
And since Marietta mentioned prior written notices, we also would expect that they're going to be a lot beefier prior written notices than we typically get. There will be a lot more relevant factors, and many of them will relate to the students participating in a program of study towards earning the South Carolina high school credential, because it's just going to make their program look different. And there may not be any good place, any one place to note all of it in the IEP. It'll be in bits and pieces in different sections. But in the other relevant factors question on the IEP, that will be a good place to summarize what's happening with this student because they're state credential. You know that accurate statements in the present levels of academic and functional performance provide the starting point for all the decisions about the IEP. That is your general narrative statement, where you're talking about how the student compares with non-disabled peers and giving just some generalized statements about their skills levels, their strengths, and their needs. And then you'll move into specific data, skills level data. But your annual goals should be developed just like they are for all the other annual goals that you write for all of your students. Specific, student by student, based on skills level data. They have to be developed for all areas that require special education or related services, as in the IEP. Your related services are not going to look any different unless there is something related to, let's say, OT, for example, that may impact their work in the community depending on what work they're doing. OT may have to be involved in a little greater role in determining what's appropriate in the workplace. The same thing with PT or orientation and mobility. Whatever is necessary is what you're going to have to do. But the goals must relate to all the special education needs, service needs, and the related service needs, just like they always have. And again, you have to think about up front, how are you going to address the related service needs with this student if they're not at school? Where, when, how, and who is going to provide those services? So that is a consideration that will need to be made. They should be, your annual goals should be based on skills the student needs to access and progress in the general curriculum, or in this case, in the modified general curriculum that has been defined. But your students may still have academic and functional goals. They may have academic goals only, or they may have functional goals only. That will depend entirely on the student, just like it does now. Any questions about the annual goals part of the IEP as it relates to the credential? I'm gonna keep talking, and Mike, let me know if you get some questions. In terms of services, related services and supplementary services, now this is the services section of the IEP. The big question is, how do we document work-based instruction in the services section of the Enrich IEP? The answer is sort of what we just said, and that's it depends. You all know, because you said it as many times as we have, the answer to every question is it depends. And in this case, it certainly does. It depends in this case on where the work-based instruction is being provided, who is providing that supervision. Is it with disabled peers or non-disabled peers? Is it during the school day? Is it nights and weekends? All of that will make the IEP look a little bit different. It will vary from student to student depending on the student's needs and the program that you've been developing for that student. We hope we'll discuss this a lot more in some future trainings, but for right now, all we can tell you is it's going to change as the students' needs and programs change. The age of majority, of course, is the same, on or before the student's 7th birthday, the student's 17th birthday. Goodness gracious, we haven't did that far back. 17th birthday, the student and the parent have to be informed that at age 18, age of majority will have been reached and rights transferred to the student. There is a form located in Enrich, and then the answer to the do you document it in the prior written notice question is, of course, yes, you do. You document everything in the prior written notice.
Hey, Ann, we have a few questions
Okay.
that have come in.
All right.
Could you please give us more information regarding the functional vocational assessment?
We can, just a little bit, and we'll give, there'll be more of that forthcoming too. The functional vocational assessment may need to be conducted for some of your students in addition to just the general observational kinds of things that you routinely gather, that information. That would not be a formal functional vocational assessment. The kinds of assessments that Voc Rehab does, for example, those are specific vocational functional assessments, functional vocational assessments, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Voc Rehab. That's just one we're all familiar with. If you're planning to do that, though, you will need to document that evaluation process in Enrich. You will need to do an evaluation review, plan what information you need to gather, plan who's going to do it, just like you do if it's a routine 3-year reeval and you're going to get new academic assessments. Same process. Then you will need to get consent from the parent or the adult student to conduct that evaluation. And then the evaluation is going to look like whatever you planned, whatever it looks like, and it will be different from student to student. But at the end, there will be one evaluation report, if you will, that you will need to upload into Enrich. So that the vocational evaluation will be in Enrich, just like your 3-year reevals are in Enrich, just like your initial evals are in Enrich. What the actual evaluation looks like will vary from student to student, but the process for it needs to remain an evaluation process as it looks in Enrich. That will be in the new process guide when it comes out as well.
Gotcha. Okay, and last one for now. I thought we were previously told that location, for example, a science classroom, is not an acceptable condition in the goal.
She didn't say that it would be the science classroom as in the goal. What Ann said was that using the credentialed science curriculum, the student will, and then it's going, the rest of the goal would be addressing certain skills like reading or using math and things like that. It's not the condition is not a location as to where the goal is going to be taught. It can be the materials that are being used and the strategies that are being used and so forth. But no, it's not the location.
Unless, of course, the child is in a co-taught science or social studies class, in which case
And you could say
it would be in the general ed classroom. Just like you would now if you have a student who is doing co-taught only, their services are being provided in general ed. But that'll be student specific as well. But
Okay,
I think,
and we are all caught up on stats for now.
and I was just going to say, I think what I meant to say, if I misstated it, I apologize for that. What I meant to say was using that curriculum, not in that location. Okay, all right. So as what we were talking about this a minute ago was using outside agencies at IEP meetings. As we said, we think we'll see more of this.
that's what. Again, just to reiterate, be sure to get the consent prior to sending out the meeting notice, and then make sure that that agency or that person, if it's a representative of the work-based site that the student's attending, make sure that that is on the meeting notice, that person or that agency is on that notice when it goes out. And again, we don't have any control, and you don't have any control over whether or not they attend, but if they are going to be providing information and the student's going to be working in that particular setting, it's a good thing to include them. But like Ann said, they could provide the information in a written format through some other person who is also helping with that student in that job site and so forth. So, but just make sure you follow the procedures for outside agency and not just have them show up and be there and sign an IEP, the IEP.
And if you do invite them and you're counting on them to provide some information and then they don't come, in terms of a compliant meeting, that's okay. They're not a required participant just because you invite them. They're just an invited participant. So as long as you have your required members, you go right ahead with the meeting. And they can certainly provide information in writing ahead of time. That'd be great. If they don't, someone should be able to at least summarize what's been happening in the workplace. And this is just the overall IEP process. This is the same one you've seen before for everyone who is of transition age and when you develop their IEPs. We put this in here just so that you know it's the same process. Nothing changes about the process because the student is pursuing the South Carolina high school credential. What changes is some of the specifics in certain sections, but your overall IEP process for transition age students does not change because the student is pursuing the state high school credential. Does that make sense to everybody?
This is what you always see we put in with the mission of the mission and the vision and how we in Office of Special Education Services support the department's mission and vision. And you also know about the profile of the graduate. The thing that we always like to point out here is when you look under life and career characteristics, those pieces, special education has been addressing those for a long, long time. And we now know with the credential, it's also addressing this area, but it's also going back over to the other areas in a different way and bringing these students into a participation process for getting at what they want to do and achieving what they want to achieve through another alternative. And we were just glad to be able to be a part of that process. You'll see some resources here, and this is going to be posted, I think, through Task, and you'll be able to access these resources. And you can also contact any of us at in the office, and we can assist in any way that we can. But we've got a few more minutes before we sign off. So if there are other questions, Mike, you can bring those up.
Yep, we don't have any. If someone is interested in asking a question by unmuting themselves, and hopefully not all at one time, but we have about 5 minutes left. So and you're welcome to use the chat feature to ask the question, or to unmute yourself for any final questions before we wrap this up. And we have one here.
Okay.
Oh, not a question, but great job, Marietta and Ann. Appreciate the info. And that's from Jackie Bryant, I believe.
Thank you, Jackie. We do want to say one thing since we have a couple of minutes left, and that is that the topics that we've talked about here today in the 1 hour webinar will be discussed in much greater detail this summer at the Summer Training Institute in an all-day session with a lot of the specifics spelled out. As we get more answers, as we really look at what Enrich the updates are going to look like, we hope to be able to give more detail and answer more student by student specific questions that a district may have if you do choose to come to that Summer Training Institute. I think it's going to be offered 2 different days, the same thing, as part of the credential series. Or you can just ask us.
Next question. Will we be able to, oh, okay, I can do this one. This presentation, will we be able to have this presentation go over with our staff? And the question or the answer is yes. Usually within 24 to 48 hours. The presentation and or the webinar recording will be available on the SC Credential website. It'll be under the supplemental materials header or subpage. So that'll be available before the end of the week. And then any news on the technology course? Next question.
Not that I'm aware of. What technology course are you talking about?
Yeah, that was it. So I'm not sure if that was, and that might not be this. That might be a question for Tabitha, as it were, or someone.
And Marietta, hi, this is Kim.
Hey, Kim.
And I can address that one.
Perfect.
Well, we are working on that, and that information will be coming out to districts. It will be forthcoming very soon.
Okay, if there's not any other questions, That will conclude today's webinar. We do thank you for attending, and remember that no question goes unanswered. You can access the FAQ document, ask a unique question using the South Carolina High School Credential Inquiry Form, and/or request technical assistance by visiting thesccredential.org. Thank you and have a great day.